In this episode, we speak with Savneet Singh, the president and CEO of PAR Technology, a global leader in restaurant technology. Since taking the helm, he has led PAR's transformation from near bankruptcy to a market cap of over $2.5 billion. Building on over 40 years of experience, PAR is recognized as one of the largest suppliers of point-of-sale systems in the United States, EMEA, and APAC regions. Previously, Savneet co-founded GBI, a financial software platform for trading and storing physical precious metals, and worked in investment banking at Morgan Stanley. I'm your host, RJ Lumba. We hope you enjoyed the show. If you like the episode, click to follow.
RJ Lumba is the managing partner of GrowthCap and the executive chairman of Market Insight Media. He is the host of Growth Investor, a podcast featuring today's best investors, executives, and founders. In the minutes ahead, we'll uncover insights and strategies for accelerating growth and succeeding in business.
Savneet, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with us today. It's a delight to be with you.
Thanks for having me.
So I was revisiting kind of when we first spoke actually on the GrowthCap platform, and it was over 10 years ago. It was in 2014.
Wow.
So thanks for returning to our media. I remember at the time when we were chatting, you were embarking on a new endeavor, and then it's wonderful to see kind of what you're doing today, because I think it aligns with kind of how you were thinking about company building and investing all along. So maybe to catch our audience up, tell us the story of how you got involved with PAR Technology and then where you sit today.
Sure. I first met, or sort of was aware of the company PAR, I want to say back in 2017. I had reached out to the prior management team about potentially acquiring a small division of the company, or if they'd be interested in selling a division, and got rebuffed, but shared some information and stuff like that. And then, I want to say a year later or so, they had reached out to me about joining their board. And they had been given a list of suggested board members from one of their shareholders, and I was on that list. And when I first looked at it, I said, listen, it's probably not the right thing for me. It's a little bit messy. My background was more software, and this business was much more of a hardware and services business that had a few $1 million software business, albeit growing quickly. But, I met the team. I met the founder of PAR, who, I thought was just a really special person. And ironically, the company is headquartered 90 minutes from where I grew up. So there was a nice, potential chance to see my father more. And I ended up joining the board. And the thesis of me joining the board was, hey, PAR has historically been this cyclical hardware and services company. Now we're growing the software business. We wanted somebody that had a bit of a growth DNA to them to help us add that to the board level. And so I joined the board. Within 2 months of joining the board, we went through a bunch of different challenging experiences. We had one activist that then became a second activist, or very loud, sort of demanding a sale. Our products were really starting to suffer, and you could see that from just the emails you get being like, oh my God, angry customers are emailing the board about how angry they are. And so I spent some time with the management team and, really started pushing the board to sell the company, because I was really nervous that we were going to miss the window. And the perspective came down to three really basic things, which was first, that software product we have, while it's maybe 5 million of the 175 or 180 million of revenue we have, while it's a great product, it is breaking and it's just not big enough to cover up the rest of the revenue. And we had 45 versions running. The product was breaking in front of our customers' eyes. It just wasn't working. The second observation was it was structurally set up for failure. We didn't have enough money, and enterprise software is not a business you can bootstrap. You really got to put money behind it. And we didn't have the money to do that. And the money we did have, we were putting in there, which was kind of bankrupting the rest of the company. Our culture was a disaster. We had kind of an interim CEO who had a chief of staff who was really running things, but then nobody knew who they reported to. It was a hardware team running a software business. The culture was broken. So, the customers were pissed, the employees were pissed. And then you had all these distractions, which was the third observation, which was activist shareholders, SEC and DOJ investigations for bribery and corruption. We were sort of limited what we can do because we were being investigated for all these horrible crimes. And, our prior CFO went to jail for stealing money. It was a really mess. And so, I looked at that as an outsider and said, we should sell the company. This is not, worth trying to turn around. And particularly because the software business was just too small and it wasn't working. And the board decided to sell. We started looking for a new CEO. And then honestly, when we gave up the search to find a new CEO, that's when I became the CEO, because it was like, all right, we can't find a CEO. We still have these challenges. Why don't you go sell the company? And that's how I actually fell into the CEO seat.
And knowing what you knew about the company, you might have been like, okay, this definitely has to get sold and all these problems have to get resolved. Was there a part of you that was like, okay, this would be a really interesting challenge to turn around and get right-sided?
That happened later. When I got there, I tell the story a lot, but on the first day, Brian, our CFO, at the end of the day, comes in and he says, "Hey, we've probably got like 8 to 10 weeks of real runway left." And he literally was like, "Is that enough time to sell the company?" And I was like, we have not even finished the first round of management meetings yet, let alone, created the data room and all the diligence. And, diligencing part would have been hard, right? Because we had the SEC and DOJ investigations. Like, it would have taken a long time to get this thing sold. And so it was that moment where I was like, oh my gosh, like we need to, while we try to sell the company, we got to fix the company because we can't go BK while we're trying to sell. And so it was that moment. And so then I started, not being the caretaker CEO and actually being the CEO and running it as my baby, because I didn't want to be the guy that took it down. And so, I went really deep, and, I sort of got very close with the employees, started meeting all the customers, shareholders. And, it was during that journey of trying to sell the company that I got actually very passionate about this idea that software was disrupting the restaurant and the retail world. And those businesses didn't quite realize yet, or didn't realize how much it was going to happen. And we had this theory, which very much holds true to today, that the way that most of these businesses are going about adopting technology is the wrong way, in our opinion, which is they're going out and buying dozens of different software products, plugging them in, and hoping it's going to create this beautiful experience. And our philosophy was back then, which is your digital experience and your in-store experience need to be the same thing. If you're a fine dining steakhouse, you can't have a cheap loyalty app. Conversely, if you're a fast food chain, your loyalty app's got to give the same ethos, feel, brand promise. If it's got to be fun and light or serious, whatever. And if you've got 50 vendors trying to make that happen, it's never going to work. And so we wanted to consolidate these technologies to unify that experience. And that was kind of what we got excited about building. So when our bankers failed to sell the company, they sort of came and said, "Hey, we could go raise a bunch of money if you wanted to make this into your next thing." And by that time, I had gotten really convicted on this idea that we could potentially like solve these problems. And so that's how I got there. It was never planned, and it kind of just came about.
Yeah, it seems like there could be like a really interesting whole business case study written on this, and all the different aspects you had to solve, given you were solving multiple things at the same time. But what was like your primary focus when you decided to, in earnest, become the CEO and try to build a company?
So let's put aside like the cashing. So the acute need was like cash, right? So it was massive restructuring. I think the thing I focused on most was creating a mission, a vision, and a culture. And it sounds silly, but now when people say, "Hey, how did the company go from near close to running out of money to what it is today?" I said we aligned on a vision and a mission, and then we built a really intense culture. And so I obsessed on that. So literally, I remember my first or second week on the job, after we'd done these big restructuring, we did this massive restructuring, laid off 25% of the workforce. And I got, on our little stage and said, "Hey, like, here's what we did today." And the employees were first shocked because they're like, "Wait, normally when there's a layoff, like management doesn't even come to the office." And I remember that was the advice I got. And I said, no. Like, if I treat them like my partner, they'll act like my partner. If I treat them like kids, they'll act like kids. And so we do this layoff, and I say, "Hey, all those 150 people, we just disrupted their lives forever. We've made them insecure for the rest of their life. They're going to feel there's a moment in their life where they weren't good enough. And that's not fair on them. And it's not their fault. It's the fault of every person sitting in the front row and myself for getting paid these big salaries and not doing our job. And that's why they don't have it. And all the blame should go to that front row and me." And that was literally my first address to the company. And so it was an example of creating that culture of accountability. And then we started doing all sorts of stuff to sort of prove it. And so, for example, we went to the company and said, "Hey, if you find $1 of savings, here's 5 cents in your pocket." I remember I did fun stuff like, if you found a recurring meeting or report that we didn't need anymore, you got paid $1,000. I remember when people would send me emails, it was so formal. It was like, "Savneet, comma, did a perfect punctuation." And I could just say, "Man, RJ, you probably spend more time formatting that email than sending me the damn substance of the email." And so I reply back in all caps, or do an entire email in the subject line, or like purposely have horrible punctuation just to encourage, collaboration. I started showing up to the office in a t-shirt. And then most importantly, I showed up. I went front and center and, took on helping run the product vision. I met dozens and dozens of customers, got screamed at, got yelled at, went to the office. And so, I think it was a lot about creating that culture of, hey, this isn't the company that you think it is or you thought it was. This is something new. And so that was by far the biggest thing we did.
For the benefit of our audience, can you tell us about your backstory? The start to your career was equally, if not more, interesting. So tell us about kind of your early career and your first kind of entrepreneurial venture.
Oh man, I had a lot. I mean, I had a unique kind of childhood where that probably started. But I started out, I was a really good tennis player, and my dream was to be a professional tennis player, and that's all I thought about, all I did. And then, when I realized, later that I didn't want to, very much, by the way, my father, who was massively disappointed that I didn't go for it. A funny story, which probably tells a lot about who I am. When I was like, I don't know, 15 or something, I remember telling my dad, I'm not going to become a professional tennis player. Like, I'm not really growing beyond like 5'10", It was after dinner, my mom and I told my mom and we kind of like rehearsed it or whatever. And I remember my dad going to me, he's like, okay, so you're a quitter, right? And I'm like, no. I just like, I want to be like a doctor like you and like I really be in science. I want to go to good school. And he's like, okay, but you're a quitter. He's like, I still love you, but I want you to realize that today that you were a quitter. And I never want to hear that happen from you again. And so, anyways, I tell that story because that very much was like the thesis of my life of never having that moment again with him. And so I remember that summer, my dad came to me, my brother and I, and said, listen, if you guys aren't going to play tennis anymore like you did, you can't sit around and play video games. Go get a job. And we're like, Dad, we don't want to get a job. We're like, we just finished school. He's like, all right, you got to make $2,000 by the end of the summer. And so my brother and I were like, okay, we'll figure it out. And so we started selling baseball cards on eBay. Fast forward, by the time we graduated college, we had bought our own cars. We had paid for like college already. And so that was my first entrepreneurial endeavor, which was we started buying and selling baseball cards on eBay and built a relatively big business. And so I always had this entrepreneurial gene. And then in college, I stumbled into Buffett because of my dad, and I got obsessed. And so I went the very traditional finance path. But deep down, I always had this sort of like, what if we could do this? What if we could do this? And so I kind of think I was wired to be entrepreneurial. It wasn't something I read in a book. It was just my natural tendency.
But then how did you come up with the idea to kind of democratize like physical gold ownership?
So, it was 2009 or 10, and, we'd gone through the crisis, and I met a couple investors who were talking about this idea of making gold digital. And I had been really into this idea of creating a marketplace for collectibles. And so, we kind of joined forces and created this idea of making alternative assets available. And, it was a wide thesis that we ended up narrowing into just trying to deliver technology that could create access to a market that historically didn't have any access from the outside. And, it was a very traditional entrepreneurial experience, but it's funny because, back then, fintech wasn't even a thing. And I remember, we would have customers, and I think this is right, but I got to recall, but I think we raised our Series A round because a customer demanded that we have X million dollars in the bank just to keep it there that we couldn't touch because they needed to make sure we'd be solvent. Like today, in taking risk and entrepreneurialism is encouraged by big financial institutions, but back then it was a really different experience. And so we went through this insane kind of journey, but it was really that idea of, it sounds so naive now, but can we create the New York Stock Exchange for hard assets? And we ended up narrowing it just to focus on precious metals, which ended up being a great decision and a great outcome. But I think the bigger part was, you learn a lot about building and shipping a product when you start from zero. You learn a lot about how hard it is to sell into the enterprise, and you either love it or you hate it. We had lots of people that left because selling enterprise software is a year or 2 year long sales cycle. But I was kind of wired for that. I enjoyed like that thrill, and I also enjoyed like losing and then finding a way to get back in it, which is the cool part about the enterprise sales process. So anyways, a few of us came together. We kind of stumbled on the idea of creating this alternative marketplace for hard assets and then narrowed into precious metals.
And give us a sense for the scale it reached, because then you partnered with Goldman.
Yeah, I would say when I left, we were probably, I would suspect, the largest provider of physical gold to the sort of investment market is my guess. If you go to most large institutions, they probably leverage our technology. So it took us a while to hit our stride, but we really stumbled onto something, if you will. And then, as you can imagine, the growth in Bitcoin and other alternative assets encouraged others to look into this market. And so when we started, it wasn't really a cool and interesting thing to do. Today, it's like really cool and hot again. And it also got us very early into the crypto world because we were then looking at solutions for that market. And so there were a lot of externalities that came out of it. We were super lucky.
Now, going fast forward back to PAR Technology, are you envisioning, and we talk about like consolidating and maybe like bringing all these restaurant related solutions together in one place? Are you looking even beyond that? Like, is this going to become like a holding company that acquires a lot of different software or tech assets?
So I don't think we look at it as a holding company. It's funny, before I took over PAR, I was trying to create my own Constellation software. And back then, my concern with the Constellation model was, is it tapped out? Meaning, how long will the public markets give you credit for saying, hey, I'm going to go buy a bunch of stuff at 1 to 2 times recurring revenue, and magically when I buy it, it's now worth 6 times. That seemed like an arb that could only be done by a few people. In many ways, you're trusting the cash flow deployment of a CIO in that model. You're not really a software company. And it's an amazing model. And I always feel like I was really early in the Constellation story. And I feel like have now brought hundreds of thousands of people into understanding what they are. But way back then, my thesis was, man, 1, there isn't a big moat here. And there's so many people that could do the exact same thing. 2, like, would you get that arb on multiple forever? And that was my like fear. And so my thesis on PAR was, if we did it in a verticalized manner, where you actually were creating product synergy amongst your products, that's where you get the multiple, because that's actually a real moat, because you're an expert in that vertical. You can cross-sell, upsell, find layers for growth that are not just, let me cut price and, I can deal with the churn. And so we wanted to verticalize it. And that was PAR was so exciting to me, which was, it was my way of creating not a holding company, but a verticalized, business that had a lot of the same culture and thesis and views on running a company, but in a vertical nature. That was why I did. Now, I was wrong, and there's been plenty of runway on that constellation model, and probably still is. But that was how we built PAR, was a very vertical focused initiative, not a let me buy a bunch of random stuff.
So it's in the vertical, just to be clear, is restaurants and retail?
That's right. And so we look at everything as, if we buy another product, that product has to connect into something that we already have so that we can create a unique outcome for the customer that they couldn't have before. So it's said differently. If you were to buy that second product from another vendor, you would not get the same functionality you'd had if we had bought it. And so that's the idea. And that's a real moat, right? Because if I can say, hey, your email's here, your calendar's there. Now when I put them together, you get all this special sauce. Like, you're never going to churn off of me. And that to me deserves a really powerful multiple long run versus, hey, these are two companies. I'm going to get them to ROICs of here. Then I'm going to take the money and go deploy it elsewhere.
We're coming up on time, and I have two final questions. But before I hit on those two final questions, I feel like you would have, out of all the people I interview, you would have great advice to other entrepreneurs because you've done it in different kind of formats. What's one piece of advice you could share to either an aspiring entrepreneur or one that's early on in their journey?
The one that I think is most important is be sincere in your desire to be an entrepreneur. And what I mean by that is, you actually have to want to be obsessed with the product that you're building. So not want, but you need to be obsessed with the product you're building. And the reason why is, a lot of people jump into jobs and starting companies because of the fun stuff. Oh, I'm going to raise a venture round. I'm going to meet all these fancy investors. I'm going to have a board. I'm going to get media attention. I'm going to be cool on social media and LinkedIn. And then you realize that in every business, you're going to get punched in the face 100 times before you get one real win. And you need to believe so convicted that your product is actually good, but also more importantly, you need to be that naturally interested in it that you never give up on it. And that to me is like the number one thing. And my number of advice to people tell me, hey, I want to start a company, particularly if those that are leaving the financial services industry, I'm like, don't do it. Like, imagine your salary. Now imagine taking like 1/5 of that. And now imagine you're going to take 3 years before you feel like you've made any accomplishments. And everything that you were taught about what makes a good talent is completely different. And so that only works if you actually believe in what you're building. And it doesn't work if you're doing it for all the other stuff, which is, I want to make a lot of money. I tend to find that the failing way to go into it.
Want to add on to that, do you spend most of your time on product?
So for the first 4 or 5 years, it was. Today, I would say it's more on people. I spend most of my time trying to find people to help us keep the best products in market and win our customers. But today it's way more on people.
Last two questions. One is, can you tell us about a person who has had a profound influence on you?
I mean, without question, for me, it's my dad. My dad was not a normal dad. He did all this crazy stuff to us. I've shared some of this with you in the past, but as long as I remember, my dad was not the typical, immigrant parent who said, go become an engineer or a doctor or a lawyer. His whole perspective was, I suffered and struggled to get here. Like, why would you just become a lawyer or a doctor? Why would you go for something big? Because what's the point of life? And when someone tells you that a lot when you're younger, it does wire you to take a big bet and do something that, hopefully can change people's lives or change the world in some way. And I think that was like the biggest takeaway. I think, look at my brother and my sister. We didn't come from an entrepreneurial family. Like, I don't think there was an entrepreneur in our family. My grandparents were social workers. My grandmother on my dad's side was a principal of the school. We were radicals in many ways for sorts of social stuff, but we were not entrepreneurs. And so I think that like wiring of like, you live on this earth once and you got such a short time, like, why not do something special and take a risk? And so that non-traditional way of thinking really stuck with us. And then his reinforcement circle around it of just that story I told you about tennis, and there's, dozens of other stories like that. So he's probably had the most impact on me.
Last question. Can you tell us about a charity, cause, or other endeavor that you're passionate about?
There are a lot, but as I get a little bit older, I think stuff that I'm really I obsess over is this idea of circumstance and luck having an impact on your life. And, I can tell you a really sob story of my life. I've gone through, crazy trauma as a family, financial, losing a parent young, having health stuff, all sorts of crazy stuff you would never believe. But I always been like, man, I was born in America to parents that stress education. And like, you hear how lucky I was to have my father. And that was an unfair stroke of luck that I got that, relatives of mine in India didn't have as an example. So most of the charity work I do now, I really obsess on how do you create circumstance for somebody else? And so, like when I look at myself and I look at the people at PAR who, for example, work on our shipping out our point of sale terminals, I'm like, man, the delta between me and them is not actually that big. I just happened to got lucky with the family that I was born into. And so a charity that I look, it's called SHDF. It's based in Maryland, but does work in India where you can pay for a child's university education for 1 year for like $600. And it's incredible because to get the scholarship, I think your parents have to make less than $1 or $2 a day, and you've got to write an essay. And I was like, man, that is the best way to create circumstance for somebody in a less fortunate way.
That's awesome. And we'll put a link to that charity in our show notes.
Cool.
Savneet, thank you so much. This has been great. I know you have a busy schedule, and I appreciate you taking the time.
Thanks, RJ. Congrats on everything you built.